1 minute. Yeah. Okay.
Did you read the latest biography, sir? Peter Salmon's book?
Yeah, it's a bit disappointing, I thought. Yeah. I mean, it's trying to do two jobs, isn't it? It's trying to give a brief biography or a fairly schematic outline of the life, and at the same time explicate the text, or at least introduce people to the main ideas. And it falls in between two stools, really, I think.
Yeah,
I certainly think for the life, you'd much better read Peter's.
Benoit Peters, yes. That is it's huge, but it's really worth the time.
Yeah.
I was really fascinated by the response to Derrida's death by many Derridians, including you, sir. In fact, there's something I want to ask you. There's so many Derridians responding, right? Hillis Miller published a collection of essays. Jeffrey Bennington, many others who respond to poetry. That is wonderful.
I think a lot of people felt a sense of profound loss, actually. Partly, I suppose, because he died, well, comparatively young. Partly because he was so productive and active to the very end. And partly because I suppose they've been reading him, most of them, since their most formative years. And me included. So he made an enormous impression. And it was the rare thing was that it was a sustained impression. Every book he produced, despite there being so many books, seemed to say something new. I mean, something recognizable in retrospect as being the kind of thing he would have to say, but not predictable at all.
Okay. By the way, are these poems yours? You wrote these poems?
Of course. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Wrote them during lockdown, during the coronavirus period. So.
But sir, you managed to publish it too, right?
Yeah, I was surprised. I thought it would be next year the book came out, but they've moved fast. So.
Oh, that's right.
The soft copy has already published, sir. And the paperback will come on 1st of December 2020.
I think the 1st of December is the official... Yeah, 1st of December.
1st of December, yeah. It's already announced in their website.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So that's very new. I mean, beautiful way of discussing Derrida. I mean, deconstruction through poetry. That's a very new way of doing it. Wonderful.
It's I think some people will think it's rather perverse to do it in formal verse, rhyming verse, but I'll talk about that a bit later on.
Yeah.
Peter Thomas, sir, can we start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Christina?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Am I audible, Tom?
Yes, Christina. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. A very good afternoon and good evening to all. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome you all to the second session of the third lecture of the Berkman's Autumn School of Critical Theory 2020, organized by the Department of English, St. Berkman's College. The second session of today's lecture is also led by Professor Christopher Norris. My name is Tom Sebastian, and I am accompanied by my colleague Christina George, who will be reading out a few instructions. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you, Tom. Here are a few guidelines that the participants are requested to kindly keep in mind to ensure the smooth functioning of our program. Participants are humbly requested not to introduce yourself in the chat box, as this may distract the speaker. All the questions that are intended for the Q&A session are to be posted in the chat box, addressing it to everyone. If your official name is different from your Zoom ID, please ensure that you change it to your name while posting questions in the chat box. A feedback form will be posted at the end of the session in Zoom and in YouTube. E-certificates will be issued to only those who are present throughout the meeting and submit the feedback form towards the end. Participants are requested to fill in the feedback forms accurately, as this is also a record of your attendance. Unfortunately, it is not possible for us to post the feedback form in WhatsApp groups. Any WhatsApp, email, or telephonic queries about the non-submission of the feedback form, regardless of the reason, will not be entertained. These are just a few guidelines to keep in mind. Thank you for listening. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Christina. Now we welcome Professor Christopher Norris to give the lecture. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Nitin, I'll stop talking at 2:30. Yes, and we'll have some questions.
Yeah, so you can talk up to 2:30. Your
2:30.
time, 2:30. Yeah. So then from 2:30 onwards, we have that Q&A session, question and answer session.
Okay. Righto. Well, I finished this morning talking or briefly introducing this term, this crucial term, aporia, or aporia, let's say, which is central to Derrida's thinking and seems to go way back into, beyond his earliest writings, into something that you could almost say is a part of his psychobiography. And aporia, in philosophical terms, is a kind of blockage. What it meant literally in ancient Greek was an unpassable path, which is itself an aporetic sort of idea. So it's a path that, it's not that it leads nowhere, but it leads to two places. So the metaphor really is drawn from the idea of a path that forks. And the strength of the idea for Derrida comes from the idea that both those forks are in some sense necessary. They're consequential. They follow on from what's gone before. So you reach a point in an argument where the argument pulls in two directions. And you can't simply abandon one of them because the force, the argumentative force, the logical, consequential force, is such that you can't let go of either of them. But they can't be resolved. This is where it differs from the idea of paradox. I said this morning that a typical paradox would be one of the paradoxes of the great religions, especially the monotheistic religions, the point where logic tells you that these two propositions can't both be true, they can't both be valid, but you can't escape them because you are driven to recognize this bifurcation, if you like. So it's something stronger than a paradox. It doesn't settle down into a reassuring belief that although these truths appear to be we could see, or if only we could think deeply enough to grasp that deeper level, then the paradox would resolve itself into some kind of mystical or theological resolution. We might have a look at the poems on this theme because it is so important to Derrida. They're on page 102 of the poem text. And Derrida says in his book, Aporias, which is one of his later books, toward the end of his life, he wrote, the last 15 years of his life, really, a series of much shorter books. His early books are very long. They really are sort of book-sized books. But these are much shorter, much more aphoristic, more condensed and pointed, and I think in that sense more poetic. So Aporias is a book about this key concept. Derrida would say that it's not exactly a concept. A concept is something that by definition we can grasp. It comes from the Latin for to grasp. It's the idea of bringing two ideas together in a conceptual form, in the form of a single concept. So the etymology of the word goes back to grasping together. But an aporia is not a concept because it doesn't settle down. It doesn't resolve itself into any kind of static form. And you can see from what I said this morning how this idea of the conflict between stasis and the dynamic or the processual is absolutely basic to Derrida's thinking. So he says in this book, Aporias, I keep the word problem for another reason, so as to put this word in tension with another Greek word, aporia, which I chose a long time ago, without really knowing where I was going, except that I knew what was going to be at stake in this word was the not knowing where to go. So the only thing he knew was that this word was his key, if you like, to opening up the possibility that certain themes, certain topics were inherently aporetic. Aporetic is the adjective from aporia. So he says, crossing this strange border and letting oneself be carried beyond the limits of truth, which is the subtitle of his book, must be possible, indeed inevitable, in order for such a defect to exceed the singular cases and thereby spread its contagion to the point of becoming general. And this is the refrain, if you like, the repeated motif of a lot of Derrida's early work, the fact that these words have a radically destabilizing effect on the entire discourse of which they're a part. We'll see that there's a series of words, différance with an A in the last syllable, which I talked about this morning, supplement, which I'll be talking about in a moment, and pharmakon, the Greek word in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus. And they all have this unsettling effect, which disrupts traditional categories, traditional distinctions or classifications. So the poem, it begins with a reference to a very famous poem by Robert Frost, the American poet, who for a long time has been regarded as the most American poet, very much in the native grain, a certain kind of sort of homegrown wisdom, which is thought to be very, very American. He wrote a famous poem about the path not taken. And it's a poem about coming to, if you like, an aporia. It's coming to a division of paths where the path goes two ways, divides into two. And the speaker takes the path less taken, less trodden, the unusual, the exceptional, the eccentric path, if you like. And I was put in mind of that poem reading Jonathan Culler's book. Jonathan Culler has written a lot about deconstruction. He's one of the leading American, US proponents of deconstruction. And he has an interesting reading of this poem by Frost, where he says that although the speaker in the poem claims to be taking the path less taken, the path that is not often traveled, and so becomes a kind of pioneering figure, striking out into the wilderness. In fact, that's very typically American. So Culler points out there's a kind of contradiction there, a kind of aporia. The poem is presenting the speaker, or the speaker is projecting himself as a sturdy, pioneering, original, individualist sort of character. But that is the most typical thing in the world. That's part of the American myth. The whole idea of sort of westward migration, breaking up new territories. And of course, a lot of violent things go along with that. So I'll read the poem now. Just one path taken, sticking point uncrossed. Thought troubling aporia soon appeased. A slightly different hike, a passage eased by sage reflections drawn from Robert Frost. Let thinking take both paths, and there's a cost in mind tracks twisted, reckonings tight squeezed by unresolved elentious, logic teased beyond itself, and thought's assurance lost. Some comfort to be had from paradox, from faith in deeper truths past logic's reach, but not when aporia double locks your reasoning on two paths of thought, where each proves sound by ticking every logic box, yet honours logic only in the breach. So to honour something in the breach is to represent or embody it precisely through breaking it. So you become aware of the custom or the law or the rule in its breaking, and through its breaking, you become aware of its constricting effect. So that's the. I'll read the rest of the poem. Actually, it's a series of three sonnets. Frost's cracker-barrel wisdom rather leads the cynic to interpret it as mere homegrown US folk wisdom, that idea of paths less travelled, self-reliance, creeds, and, hard to miss for anyone who reads twice over, how the element of sheer contrariness, as celebrated here, is the stock myth on which that culture feeds. Then you may reasonably come to think that aporia brings some positives, like getting staid logicians not to blink at certain contradictions, and what gives the lesson heart, self-checking, lest we shrink our choice to forking paths where Frostman lives. So the point there about logic is that Derrida, as I read him at least, has had a lot to say about philosophy of logic. We'll see later that when Derrida talks about Rousseau and Plato and Husserl, and others, What he is exploring is the possibility of non-bivalent logics. Bivalent logic says there are two truth values, true and false. Non-bivalent or dialethic logic says it may be possible that there are truths which we have to hold in mind simultaneously. Rather like a paradox, but Derrida would strengthen it by talking about aporia rather than paradox. I'll come back to that. Let me read the last stanza of the poem. Then we'll take a practical example. Yes, it's the old Marano in me, that deep sense of non-belonging, that distaste for all groups, ethnic, land or language-based, and every claim to native habitat, advanced on shaky grounds of who begat whom way back when, ensuring those displaced, like our lot down the centuries, were faced by paths with signs that said, "Don't hang your hat." That's maybe why my thinking's found its sole true nostos in the exile's home domain of aporia, where no guards patrol the thought frontiers, where polyglots profane all sacred words, and thought exacts no toll when dialethic paths broach new terrain. This is why I said that Derrida's keen interest in aporia, in logical contradiction, in forking arguments with inconsistent conclusions, has to do with biography. It doesn't reduce to biography. The essential thing is he's doing philosophy, and philosophy, even if it springs from personal interests that have to do with life histories, cannot be reduced to it. That would be to underestimate Derrida as a philosopher. But his experience, his childhood, after all, he grew up in Algeria. He was in his late teens, early 20s when the Algerian War of Independence took place, a very ferocious war of independence. He was a victim of anti-Semitic prejudice as a child. He was expelled from his primary school under the rules introduced by the Vichy government in France when France was still in control in Algeria. So he suffered exclusion. He was himself Sephardic Jewish, but of Arab appearance. He never felt at home in any language. He adopted French, obviously, for academic and writing purposes, but always felt that French was not his language. It was his adoptive language, but not in any sense his native language. So he was tugged in many directions. He experienced this kind of cultural pull of opposing forces in a very acute and very personal way. So it is fair to claim that his interest in aporia and his extreme sensitivity to aporetic moments in texts has something, and in fact has a lot, to do with his experience and his acute awareness of being displaced and marginalized many times over. So again, his interest in margins. I mentioned the title of his book, Margins of Philosophy. And this way he keeps his eye sort of keenly trained for the marginal detail, for the anomalous or discrepant marginal detail. This has something to do, psychobiographically, it has something to do with his experience, especially his early and childhood experience, and his experience as a wanderer. I mean, in the years of his fame, just the sheer amount of travel he did is quite staggering, actually. So all kinds of things going on in this keenness on the idea of aporia. And as I say, I think that one reason to feel disappointment at the lack of interest in Derrida among analytic philosophers, including logicians, is that they've missed out on some exceptionally insightful and original ideas about logic, about the possibility of non-standard, non-bivalent, deviant logics, which doesn't mean his writing is illogical. It means it's testing the limits of classical logic all the time. Let me give you one example now of Derrida's deconstructive reading strategy at full stretch. And it's a favorite example of mine, partly because it is so sustained and because it makes the point that when Derrida reads texts, he's not just looking for isolated passages where you find something interesting, but he is doing a systematic and very intense close, focused, and sustained reading of a whole body of an author's work. The author in this case is Rousseau, the 18th century French writer, who wrote on a vast range of topics. He wrote about the history of language, the history and development of music, the relationship between speech and writing, the history of civil institutions and politics. He wrote about music, about the relationship between melody and harmony. He wrote fiction. He wrote an autobiography, his Confessions, which many people consider to be the first really modern autobiography, very sort of frank and confessional, and exposing all his faults and sort of excoriating himself for his moral defects and so forth. So very productive, very voluminous, and very influential writer who had a powerful influence on the forces that eventually erupted in the French Revolution a half century later. Now, Derrida has clearly read an enormous amount of Rousseau, and he's read commentaries on Rousseau, and he writes out of a deep, passionate involvement with Rousseau's writings. And the thing that strikes him about Rousseau, and that gave rise to Derrida's book, still among his very greatest books, I think. Well, he says, don't call it a book, it's a text. And I'll explain that later on, the distinction between book and text. But the thing that snagged Derrida's attention in reading Rousseau was one particular word. And this is the case with most of Derrida's lengthy, sustained, close readings. His attention has been riveted by a certain word, a key word. And in this case, it is the word supplement. And what so struck Derrida when he came across it and noticed how often it repeated itself was that supplement, the word, is in itself ambiguous. A supplement can be one of two things, or it can be both, Derrida would say. A supplement can be something which is additional, added on, something which is unnecessary, not integral, something which is artificial to the extent that it doesn't belong to the original thing, whatever kind of thing it is. So that would be a mere supplement, a trivial addition, a trivial unnecessary addition. But there's another sense in which a supplement is something that comes to fill an existent lack. Okay, so as in the case of a vitamin supplement, if you take tablets daily to increase your vitamin intake and make up for something, for lack of sunshine, perhaps, or for lack of some other sort of nutrient in food, that is a different sense of supplement, because it means something that is necessarily added in order to constitute a whole. Okay, so in order to constitute the whole of the necessary daily intake of vitamins that you need in order to remain healthy. So Derrida says that if you look at the way Rousseau uses this word supplement at crucial points in his writing, where he's trying to sort of push home the consequences of his argument, or to maintain some position that's crucial to him, he says, you see that this word is serving a double function. The word goes beyond anything that Rousseau kind of intended to say. It tells us something about his text and its meaning that he would probably have rejected had someone confronted him with this interpretation. He'd have held out against it and questioned its probity. So take some examples. Rousseau typically values nature above culture, not just in the sense that he likes to go out for country walks and appreciate nature, which he does famously, but in the sense that he believes that some things are natural, they are at least as close to nature as we can get, and other things are merely cultural. He thinks of nature as being the source, the origin, the ground of everything, the starting point, the essential, the most important and authentic example of something. Culture is always something derivative, secondary, parasitical, all negative terms, all very pejorative terms. Rousseau says, humanity once existed in a state of nature. Rousseau is always sort of advancing very large speculative historical claims as if they are simply matters of fact. So human beings once existed in a state of nature. They didn't need elaborate social structures. They didn't need representative systems of government where you have delegated authority, delegated to a government or a parliament or representatives or whatever. They didn't need that because they assembled in small groups, they spoke to each other directly, they discussed things and decisions, and their social structures, such as they were very simple at that stage. So they lived in a state of grace before the advent of culture. And as far as Rousseau is concerned, in this very sort of schematic, binary scheme of things, the advent of culture was a disaster because it forced people apart. It alienated people, really in a kind of proto-Marxian sense. It alienated them from their natural existence and from enjoying the products of their own labor, because it introduced the idea of first barter and then exchange through a monetary system. So wherever culture intrudes on nature, it introduces corruption, social decay, delegated responsibility, which is a way of taking our rights away in the name of some kind of imposed social system, which eventually becomes a structure of power and a class structure and a differential set of relations between human beings. So culture for him is something bad. And this idea repeats itself constantly, replicates itself throughout Rousseau's writings. So nature, good, culture, bad. Now, what Derrida typically does when he comes across a binary distinction like that is to show that the distinction is not as straightforward as it appears. On the contrary, the binary terms, turn out to be unstable. So the first term, what appears to be self-evidently the primary term, becomes dependent upon the second term, or can only be approached via the second term. So Rousseau asks quite simply, what conception can we possibly have of nature that is not itself a cultural perception? So you may be Rousseau, who is celebrating nature and who wants to say nature good, culture bad. The further we can get back to nature and away from these bad alienating structures of culture, the better. But he winds up conceding implicitly in various passages of his work that our perceptions and conceptions of nature are themselves culturally generated. Even the romantic poets, let's say, like Wordsworth, poets nowadays, nature poets, let's say, who celebrate nature and who take a Rousseauist position in that sense, are in the end celebrating a nature that has been processed, if you like, or perceived and interpreted, and to a degree mythicized by culture, by our cultural habits of thinking about nature, picturing it, drawing our metaphors from nature. So at every point, wherever you look, you find, whether you're looking at painting or at writing or at journals or at nature poetry, what you find is a cultural representation of nature. And Derrida's attention was hooked by this regular, repeated structural inversion that happens whenever nature and culture are set up as an opposition, a binary pair. Take some more examples of that. When Rousseau writes about language, he says, originally, in the first place, when language first emerged, it was a purely spontaneous, purely natural language. It communicated emotions, sentiments directly. It was passionate. It didn't involve or admit any deception or lies or roundabout expression or irony or anything oblique or surreptitious, because it simply expressed the emotions. It was a direct registration of feelings in the act of face-to-face communication. But then he says language became more complex. It became more articulate. It developed grammar and grammatical and syntactic distinctions. It broke down into parts of speech like nouns and verbs and pronouns and so forth. And all these developments had the same kind of alienating effect that culture does, because they're a part of culture and they depend upon the development of culture in order for themselves to develop. So as language became more complex, as it became adapted to the needs of culture, because if you have a complex social system, then you need to have a complex language to articulate all the concepts and ideas within that culture. And so it became more and more alienated from the roots of language in spontaneous emotional expression. So Rousseau's idea of the original language, the early language, the first stages of linguistic development, is really a kind of pre-verbal, pre-lexical, passional speech song. He says, in fact, that music and speech have a common origin. The original language was very musical, very mellifluous, very capable through a kind of melodic pattern of expressing emotions directly. But then language became less musical. Music detached itself from language, and musicians developed their own conventions and systems and structures and tonal systems. And so, again, it's a history of decline that he's talking about. It's from nature to culture. So that's from the primitive speech, which is good and authentic and heartfelt, to the more developed, the more sophisticated language, which is bad. Insofar as it's sophisticated, is bad as far as he's concerned. He says the same about music. And this has always interested me, especially about Derrida's writing on Rousseau. Rousseau was himself a composer. He was a very busy man, Rousseau. But he wrote one particular opera. It was called Le Devin de Village, the village soothsayer, I think. And it was very simple, rather sort of folk opera, really. Not very elaborate, not much counterpoint, fairly basic harmonies. And Rousseau takes the line that melody is good, but harmony is bad. Just as the original language was good because simple and heartfelt, whereas the advanced language, so-called, was bad because complex and abstract. So in music, harmony is a bad development. Rousseau says music started out as pure melody, and that's what it should still be. But as time went on, people began to add voices and lines, and so music became more complex, and it had to be written down because once you have, 3 or 4 different voices singing different lines, different patterns of notes, it needs to be written down in order to learn it, to get it by heart. And Rousseau says this is a sign of decadence in music. The more complex music is, the more decadent and the more artificial it becomes. So ultimately, Rousseau says melody is good, harmony is bad, because harmony is a mere supplement. Just as grammatical structure is a mere supplement to the original speech, the musical speech, so harmony is a mere supplement to melody. And yet, in both those cases, there are passages, short passages, parentheses, incidental remarks in Rousseau that show that, in fact, he is aware, or some part of his mind, or let's say he is aware of the logical implication of what he's saying, and that implication undermines his article, his belief, his argument in its overt form. So, for instance, with language, he asks himself at a certain point, what does a language have to be and do in order to count as a language? And the implication is, would that primitive language really be a language? It would be a means of expression, but a very restrictive means of expression. It could express fear or love, perhaps, or hate, perhaps warning, quite a lot of basic things that language or communication might originally have been used to accomplish. But what are the minimal necessary requirements to actually speak about a culture having a language? Well, it has to be structured. It has to be a public thing. In other words, in order to communicate anything beyond the most basic emotions, there must be some, at least, basic vocabulary, word distinctions, word limits, word borders or boundaries, grammatical structures. In order to express any kind of proposition, to say something about something, you have to distinguish different parts of speech, subject and object, for instance. There has to be a distinction between noun and verb. In other words, in order to be language, a system of sounds or a set of sounds has to have structure, and the structure must precede the individual utterance. Okay, so there's a classic chicken and egg paradox here, or aporia. Which comes first? We can say, well, speech must come first because there must be sounds around. People must exchange sounds and somehow communicate something before language can begin to settle into a structure. In other words, the structure, as it were, precipitates out of the accumulation of acts of parole in Saussure sense, speech acts, individual speech acts. So there must be people around exchanging noises before those noises can begin to distinguish themselves one from another and make themselves understood as words or verbal structures. So you might say speech comes first, then language, which develops as a system out of those speech acts. On the other hand, how did those speech acts make sense originally unless people interpreted them according to some kind of pre-existing structure? There is this sort of shuttling interplay of two different ways of thinking about it, two different interpretations of the binary distinction, I suppose. So Rousseau is left perplexed. He doesn't admit the perplexity, but he writes enough to make us see that there's a tension within his argument, which is enough to perplex the reader, who wonders which of these two possible interpretations is the correct one. The same with music, and this I think is really interesting, because it's something you can intuitively check for yourselves. Rousseau says, he says quite overtly, insistently, melody good, harmony bad. Much better if music has no harmonies. And he's got an axe to grind here. He has a self-interest because his opera was not successful. It didn't have many stagings. It was not popular with the public. Whereas his contemporary Rameau, the composer Rameau, who was very prolific, wrote lots of very successful operas, and they were very complex. They were full of counterpoint, full of quite advanced harmonies, and for the time, quite experimental techniques. They were polyphonic and they were contrapuntal, lots of different lines going different ways. And Rousseau obviously resented this fiercely, that Rameau was so successful where he himself, Rousseau, was not. And he therefore takes a very strong position on this. He says melody good, harmony bad, quite simply. But then, just parenthetically, in passing, as if it's just an incidental detail, he says, but even in the case of melody, don't we hear an implicit harmony? And he even asks, could we hear a melody as a melody? Could we perceive a tune as having any kind of melodic character, unless there were a harmony along with it? This argument has multiple dimensions. There is no such thing as a pure note. If you sing a note or hum a note or play a note on the piano or any instrument, then there are overtones. There are sympathetic vibrations set up, which go off in the circle of fifths up and down from the note you're playing or singing. So any note that's played, it will not be that note on its own. It will call up this very complex, rich, far extending set of harmonic overtones and sympathetic vibrations. And when you play a tune, a sequence of notes, then that will set up a very complex interaction between the different sets of overtones as the tune moves along and different notes succeed one another. So there is a harmonic dimension even to the simplest melody, even to, to a solo song, for instance, or a single note tune picked out on an instrument. So what you have is a curious kind of reversal, and this is absolutely the heart of Derrida's deconstructive, well, whatever you want to call it, technique or method or approach, outlook. Really, it's something as broad as that. It is the idea that in any text, beyond a certain level of complexity, I mean, he's not here talking about, short phrases, or he's not talking about little texts or very, very simple texts, but beyond a certain level of complexity, the kind of thing you find in philosophy and in what we call literature, there will inevitably be generated certain unresolvable aporias. Okay, so it's a strong wager he's making, a speculative wager, which he spent his life demonstrating, I suppose, by reading a great number of texts. And his first major example, his first example was Husserl, as I said in the first lecture. But his first really sort of powerful, demonstrative, sort of set piece demonstration of how this works out in terms of a single author is Rousseau, because Rousseau uses this word supplement in such a way that both the meanings of the word, the supplement as an unnecessary extra, something merely added on unnecessarily, and the supplement as a necessary addition to fill out a defect or to remedy a lack in the original, both those senses are in play. So there's one thing that Rousseau wants to say: melody good, harmony bad, nature good, culture bad, original simple language good, complex language bad. Turns out to be falsified, if you like, or undermined, or at least seriously complicated by the second meaning. There's what Rousseau wants to say, vouloir dire, and there is what Rousseau ends up saying, because constrained to say this by the logic of his own argument. And this applies to all the texts of Rousseau that Derrida reads. For instance, when Rousseau writes about social institutions, civic structures, civil society, if you like, he says the good society is natural. It's when people exist in a blissful state of nature, and when they've not yet fallen prey to elaborate social structures, class systems, differentials of wealth, income, opportunity, education, and so forth. These things, these evils, these social evils, as Rousseau thought them, are attended upon. They're the result of the decline from nature into culture. And yet he then allows himself to ask once in a while, what is society if not structure? A society is by definition already not a state of nature. It involves certain social relationships, which, even if they're fairly simple, even if they're at the level of face-to-face communication, still involve differentials of power. It may not necessarily be tyrannical power or coercive power, but it'll involve differences of access to power, different places in a hierarchy, for instance, different social functions or roles, different kinds of delegated authority. So that kind of difference, to go back to Derrida's favorite early term, difference, is built into the very nature, the very definition, in fact, of society. So wherever you look in Rousseau, you get this self-complicating, self-undermining logic of the supplement. This is partly why I say that it would be good if philosophers of logic, those who explore non-classical, non-bivalent, dialethic logics, would have a look at Derrida's work. He also has a lot to say implicitly about tense logic, modal logic, but perhaps we'll come back to that later. So Rousseau is a very good example of how deconstruction works when it's actually applied in a systematic, large-scale way to an individual writer. Another example is Derrida's treatment of Plato. He's written quite a lot about Plato in various contexts, but his most sustained engagement with any single text of Plato's is with a a dialogue called the Phaedrus, which for a long time was regarded as one of Plato's less successful, less well-organized or well-structured dialogues. And scholars for a long time said, they said either Plato must have written this when he was very young, and so he not yet learned to write really convincing, well-structured dialogues, or he wrote it when he was very old, and so he'd lost the knack. He'd sort of lost his grip, his dialectical grip, or his sense of dramatic structure, or whatever. Derrida says they were wrong, those scholars. This is, in fact, an extraordinarily tightly structured dialogue, but you have to recognize that you have to recognize the complications in the dialogue. You have to recognize the problems with it, the aporias, again, before you realize just how subtle and how sophisticated a piece of writing it is. Now, the Phaedrus, if you've read one or two of Plato's dialogues, you'll know roughly the form they take. And the form is that of Plato writing down an account, a narrative account, some of it no doubt fictive, but some of it based on real events, about his teacher Socrates. And Socrates typically will go out onto the streets of Athens, wander around, meet someone he knows, and someone he knows to take a certain position on a philosophical question. And Socrates will say, how do you do? What do you think about this? What do you think about justice? What is justice? So he'll ask questions like, is an act good because the gods approve of it? Or do the gods approve of it because it is good, and they, being gods, know it's good, and therefore they must approve of it by definition because they're godlike and all-knowing? So it's that kind of question, which is a real question about justice, although it's put in a rather sort of mythological form. And what happens then is that Socrates tests them, quizzes them, interrogates them, sort of prods their beliefs to find out the weak points, and often makes them rather cross in the process. So on the traditional terms, a well-constructed Socratic dialogue or Platonic dialogue will sort of take a controversial topic and then put it through the dialectical mill, so to speak, and come up with some kind of conclusion. What happens in the Phaedrus is rather odd and unusual. It's about quite a lot of familiar mainstream Platonic themes, love and justice and beauty and goodness, all these Platonic absolutes which Socrates tried to approach through the dialectical method, through question, answer, through a kind of very vigorous dialectical debate. But then at the end of it, there is a myth, which struck many scholars as being a bit, if you like, supplementary, as being tacked on to the end in a kind of self-indulgent and poorly structured way. And the myth is one that has its origin in Egypt, very likely. It was an Egyptian myth. And there's a big scholarly debate about the sources of ancient Greek philosophy in North Africa, or in some cases in sub-Saharan Africa. But it's about the invention of writing. And you can see why this suddenly seized Derrida's attention. Because Derrida had already come to focus on the idea of writing. It becomes something absolutely crucial to his thinking, early and late. So the myth which Plato attaches to this dialogue is about the invention of writing. It's about an Egyptian god, a kind of sun god, Tharmas, who is supposed to be wise, omniscient, and a kind of supreme authority on all sorts of things. And it's about a lesser god called Thoth, who is pretty much the equivalent of Mercury in Greek philosophy, a messenger, but also an inventor, a very clever, ingenious figure, but at the same time rather sly and cunning, not entirely trustworthy, and apt to come up with lots of clever and useful but slightly dodgy inventions. And basically, Thoth comes to Tharmas and says, I've invented this thing, this device, this technique, I suppose, called writing. And Thoth says to Tharmas, this is a wonderful thing, because once you have writing in a culture, then you can conserve knowledge You can have progressive things like science. You can have an accumulation of knowledge in archives. You can have things recorded, written down, so they won't be forgotten. Writing is better than speech, so Thoth, the inventor, says, because it gives you permanence. Even if one piece of writing eventually rots and falls apart, you can copy it down again. And this means you can have cumulative things like science and scholarship. And come in. Oh, yeah. My wife Val is going to come in a moment, in a few minutes, when I've finished talking about this, and read a poem, and to partly to give you a bit of variety, just to. A bit of relief, in fact, from my voice, which is always welcome at this stage. So basically, he presents writing, pushes it pretty hard, like a salesman to the king. The king goes off to think about, no, I don't want it. And he says, I understand everything you're saying about writing, that it confers all these benefits on a culture, the permanence of knowledge, the archive, the possibility of progress, of having laws written down, for instance. And so to that extent, it's a wonderful thing. But, and then he gives lots of very Platonist arguments for rejecting it. It will become a kind of inert mechanical system of transcription which will invade the soul, and you can hear echoes. You can hear echoes in Rousseau of this Platonist argument. It will take over from living memory, because living memory has to do with thoughts in the mind or in the soul, and with speech. Speech is the nearest we can get to a direct, passionate expression of our deepest beliefs and our most sort of passionately held convictions. Writing is going to substitute a purely inert mechanical system of transcription for getting things by heart. Real knowledge is getting it by heart, and that can only be had through spoken communication. Now, obviously, this is a kind of 4th century BC run of arguments we hear today about social media, about AI, about the supposedly artificial, and some would say corrupting effects of that kind of mass communication. And that's been a debate that's been had over the centuries in numerous contexts, whenever a new means of transmission becomes available. The printing press, the same arguments about that. And Plato reflects the debate that was going on in 4th century BC Athens about the dangers of writing and the fact that writings can fall into the wrong hands. They can be subversive, radical, they can undermine systems of authority and power. There was a kind of collective cultural neurosis around this. So the king, the wise king, for supposedly good reasons, says, on balance, I'm going to reject this gift because it might have these, despite the benefits it brings in certain terms, it will bring other far more significant problems in its wake. So I'll talk some more about that in a moment. But in the meantime, Val's going to come in. And she's reading a poem that takes us back to what I mentioned briefly this morning, and the text, in fact, that many of you are concentrating on, Structure, Sign and Play, where one of the metaphorical oppositions that Derrida brings in is the distinction between engineer and bricoleur. And this is something he gets from Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss says the mythic imagination is a kind of bricolage. What myth creators do is they take themes, topics, notions, ideas, words, all kinds of things from a culture, and they assemble them into narratives. And those narratives can be built upon, they can be dismantled, restructured, they can be adapted, modified, adapted to different circumstances. And this is the great thing about the mythic imagination. So the bricoleur, there's no English translation of that really. But it's someone who is a gadgeteer, I suppose, someone who's really good at getting stuff off a scrap heap, perhaps. There's a popular TV program, Scrap Heap Challenge, where they get people who are really expert bricoleurs to get stuff from a pile of, automobile components and build them into weird and wonderful machines. So you've got the engineer on the one side, who's the opposite of that, who has blueprints, designs, and projects and things that are sort of controlled and start from a given point and have a definite end in view. And then you have the bricoleur. I've just got to find the page number. Remember that.
I'll get it while you continue to talk.
Oh, that's okay. I'll see it soon. There we are. It's 64. No, it's page 64. Yep. It's appropriate that Val reads this because she is an engineer. She was head of department in the materials engineering department here in Swansea, just down the road, in fact, and retired just a few years ago. There we are. So she's really well qualified to read you this poem. So, yeah, sorry.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the meeting. And yeah, I'm going to read this poem called Bricoleur, and I will read first the epigraph that goes with it. The bricoleur is adept at performing a large number of diverse tasks, but unlike the engineer, he does not subordinate each of them to the availability of raw materials and tools conceived and procured for the purpose of the project. His universe of instruments is closed, and the rules of his game are always to make do with whatever is at hand. Mythical thought is therefore a kind of intellectual bricolage. The characteristic feature of mythical thought is that it expresses itself by means of a heterogeneous repertoire, which, even if extensive, is nevertheless limited. It has to use this repertoire, however, whatever the task in hand, because it has nothing else at its disposal. So here's the poem. Let none despise the humble bricoleur, that fixer-up with all his scrap-heap gear, nor overly admire the engineer, whose blueprints gleam where ad hoc notions blur. For it's by bricolage those amateur contractors get things up and running, steer inventive routes around the gadget sphere, and so provide the expert ingénieur with project kits in plenty. How begin such grand designs if not by having those Heath Robinson constructions underpin the sweeping spans, the fine-tuned ratios, and all the high-tech miracles they spin from bits some crafty bricoleur once chose? Your low-tech myth inventor plays the game to rules that change as new stuff comes to hand. As plots combine and mytheme stocks expand, or jigsaw parts reshuffle in the frame, till a gestalt shift shows how just the same small box of tools can build the wonderland of myths, tales, customs, kinship systems, and, let's not forget, of Oedipus left lame and blind by savage fate. Admire the skill in plot design, the finely engineered encounters and reversals, if you will, but bear in mind how often they've appeared on time yet scarcely managed to fulfill our needs for ends tied up or problems cleared. Who'll chide the engineer if she reverts to bricoleur once in a while, or nabs some cast-off piece of kit that's up for grabs and, trusting more to luck than skill, inserts it at the crucial point where it exerts a new effect unknown in all the labs and lecture halls where none think to keep tabs on such like junk, or deign to bet their shirts on how it might just work. They often call it primitive, the kind of thought that runs such makeshift ways around perchance to fall on some quick problem fix. Yet he who shuns the path of chance and bricolage may trawl for streamlined fish, but miss the tasty ones. Vice versa too. The bricoleur may slip, if gadgets work, into the engineer's accustomed thought grooves, where like-minded peers dictate one's research path and thereby tip the balance, so that project teamsmanship wins out. Group interests set the course for years, and any unprepared for shift of gears will strike the management as apt to trip the whole thing up. Take Levi Strauss, the first to side with mythic bricoleurs against conceptual engineers, yet so well versed in structuralist lore that everything's condensed into a few crisp mythemes or, at worst, dragooned, anatomized and theory-fenced. Ingénieur and bricoleur, they stake it out between them, that large territory where thought takes care to guard its home domain, to sort true claims from false, and so let reason scout its furthest boundaries, at which point doubt may enter as to whether its report lacks evidential credence in the court of last appeal, where bricoleurs may flout all previous handings down. Their counsel pleads the hands-on knowledge case, one that entails an adept's willingness to follow leads way out along or off the well-worn rails it travels, when the cautionary needs of guild compliance prove a god that fails. Thank you.
Okay, so you can see that that's a classic Derridian reading. Let's just slot these pages back in. Yeah. That what he's saying is that there's a two-way dependence there. We might be tempted to think of the engineer, and you might think the project manager, or the theorist for that matter. I mean, somebody who offers a systematic theory of interpretation or a philosophical theory, as being the sort of primary instance, if you like, and the bricoleur, the gadgeteer, the person who just sort of puts bits and pieces together to assemble some kind of ad hoc machine, as being very much a secondary activity. But Derrida's point is that if you read Levi-Strauss, you find this constant shuffling. He will, on the one hand, claim that bricolage is the most typical human activity, that this so-called primitive activity of assembling mythic machines from scraps of culture is in many ways far more typical of human creativity, human adaptiveness, human intelligence generally, than the project, the grand project with blueprints and a starting program, if you like. But as he says, even bricolage involves some kind of foresight. It involves predictive thinking. It involves a forward-looking, speculative way of fitting things into a structure that's envisaged from the outset, even if it's not envisaged in clear-cut terms, like a real blueprint. And this is why Derrida's Structure, Sign and Play, why that lecture of his at Johns Hopkins had such impact, because he'd sort of wormed his way into structuralism, and he'd found this really quite sort of chronic instability at the heart of structuralism. On the one hand, bricolage, on the one hand, the very notion of structure as being inhabited and destabilized by a kind of permanent state of bricolage. On the other, the aspiration to theory, because Levi-Strauss, although he comes out in favor of the bricoleur, because he's writing about myths and myth-making, and so the myth-maker, the collective imagination applied to mythology, is for him the paradigm of human activity. On the other hand, he's a grand theorist. He writes big books. He has a structuralist theory derived from Saussure, which involves a lot of technical terminology and sort of sophisticated conceptual machinery. So Levi-Strauss is caught up in this sort of undecidable, another key Derridian term, this undecidable oscillation between system and structure on the one hand, and bricolage or piecemeal tinkering or sort of piecemeal engineering on the other hand. Okay, I'll come back to that again in the context of the word invention, which is also important for Derrida. But in the meantime, let's go back to Plato. I hope this isn't too confusing. So we left it at the point where the inventor god Thoth had offered the gift of writing to the good king, and the good king had rejected it because he says writing can only be a kind of, well, the word is mnemotechnic. In other words, a kind of technique for improving memory. And of course, human beings have all kinds of techniques for improving memory. But this, the king says, would be a corrupting kind of gift, because it would induce people, students, let's say, to substitute artificial memory programs for really learning, getting things by heart. And this is a big debate among educationalists still, just as it was in 4th century BC Athens. Should we, for instance, learn poetry by heart? One of the most striking things about Derrida's writings on poetry are that he comes out very strongly in favor of learning poems by heart. He says that a poem asks implicitly to be learned by heart. If it's really to affect us, to enter our nervous system, if you like, to sort of really reach down deep into our psychic regions, then learning it by heart may be the only way to really know a poem. That's thought of in many educational circles, at least in this country, as being a very old-fashioned, school-teacherly way of thinking about poetry. I mean, when I went to school, I had to learn poems, and well, really, when I did finals, as an undergraduate, I had to be able to quote and write down in my exam papers whole chunks of poetry, but even then it was thought of as a rather old-fashioned thing. But Derrida is very explicit about this. He thinks the best poetry, by which he means the most complex and meaningful, but also the most musically memorable, asks to be conserved in that form. And that is the argument you find the king, the good king, the wise king, putting forward in the Phaedrus. So what Derrida does basically with Plato is very close, very similar to what he does with Rousseau. He reads the text of the Phaedrus, having read the various commentaries, and Derrida is, among other things, an extraordinarily thorough scholar. Again, he's been treated very unfairly by hostile philosophers who say that he is very clever, perhaps, but that he's not read. He's read a vast amount, an extraordinary amount. The great puzzle about Derrida's life is how he fitted so much in, so much writing, all those books, all those articles, so much travel, so much lecturing, so much reading and scholarship. And his essay on Plato is an example of that. He quotes interpreters and translators and editions, and he talks about the transmission history of the Phaedrus. He's read a hell of a lot, and and one thing he contests is the idea that this is a badly constructed dialogue. He says, on the contrary, once you read it with an eye alert to the complications, then you'll recognize just how tightly constructed it is. What he fastens on, what he focuses on, is the word pharmakon. Let's find the poem. Work through the index. I've got the number written down here, actually. Here we are, page 88. Yeah. So we'll read that in a moment. The word pharmakon, which in ancient Greek meant poison and cure, just as supplement meant the two kinds of supplement, the supplement that is added on unnecessarily as a mere extra, and the supplement that is a needful addition because it is required to complete what is incomplete. So pharmakon means both poison and cure. And this had not passed unnoticed. I mean, previous scholars had noted that, and it had not been thought particularly problematic. After all, poisons can act as a cure. I mean, the basic principle of inoculation, as we know all too well at the moment, is to give a mild version of a disease in order to provoke the body to build up its resistances and to build up its defenses against the real infection, the really dangerous kind. So it's not such a paradox or such an aporetic term. But Derrida notices that in Plato's dialogue, it is always used in connection with writing. And most often, the most obvious intention, the most overt meaning, what presumably Plato meant to mean by it, if you like, is poison. The pharmakon is a poison. This is what the king is saying. It's what Thamus is saying. Writing may seem good for all those reasons that you, Thoth, have enumerated for us. It may seem like a cure for the short-term limitations of memory, oral memory, the fact that within a couple of generations, ideas will be lost. The fact we wouldn't have Plato, we wouldn't know what Socrates thought. had his thoughts not been written down by Plato. Socrates himself thought that writing was a very bad thing. It falsified ideas. It put us at two removes from ideas. Plato was more ambivalent, but nevertheless, he wrote down Socrates' thoughts, and we wouldn't know what Socrates thought unless Plato had written them down. So there's a kind of built-in structural irony there. So what Plato means the word to mean, so to speak, is writing is a poison, because it destroys living memories, because it substitutes a bad, prosthetic, artificial, supplementary system of inscription. And for all the traditional Greek reasons, so, the idea that writing can fall into the wrong hands, it can liberate all kinds of subversive and threatening anarchic forces in society if it's read by the wrong people or misinterpreted and used in the wrong way. But what Derrida also notes is that it is constantly implied in Plato's dialogue that writing is a cure. It is a cure for short-term memory. Thoth makes the point quite explicitly, and it is at no point adequately refuted in the dialogue, that writing is a prosthetic supplement to speech, which can come to substitute for speech in the absence of the addressor. So when if your thoughts are written down, then they can survive you, they can outlive you. And this is something that returns in Derrida's later work in a more elegiac mode. As his friends and contemporaries began to die in increasing numbers, he was writing many memorial articles, tributes, and funeral speeches, and that kind of thing. He became increasingly aware of the fact that writing outlives the writer. And whenever you write something down, there is a kind of inbuilt structural possibility that you will not live to look at it again or to read it. Even if you're young, the possible death and writing are very closely associated. So writing has this deep ambivalence. On the one hand, it's something that can allow your thoughts to live on after you die. You can be read by your children or by your friends, relatives, or by future generations. Or in Plato's case, you can be read 2,500 years on by Jacques Derrida, by someone who comes up with an extraordinary new interpretation of what you wrote. So there's something inherently very ambivalent, dramatically ambivalent about the very nature of writing. So Derrida's point about the Phaedrus, and its point I want to emphasize really, is that it's not just a case in the Phaedrus of occasional passages where the word pharmakon carries this double significance, writing as poison and cure. But it's the case of a series of occurrences of that word. And in each case, the word bears both those meanings. There is what Socrates means to say in the dialogue and what Plato intends to communicate, and that is writing as poison, writing as something we shouldn't desire, because it will have these bad effects on the human psyche, really, the human mind. But at the same time, there is the meaning that the logic of the dialogue insists on, and that is that we would not have this dialogue if we would not have any knowledge of Socrates' thinking, if it had been left to the devices of oral transmission, a very restricted, short-term, inherently distorting means of communication. Writing may be open to misinterpretation, but it has far more permanence, more stability, more capacity to transmit thoughts down the ages than oral tradition or folk memory, let's say. So let's have a look at page 88, the poem about the pharmakon. The quote comes from Plato's Pharmacy, from the book Dissemination, which contains the essay, the chapter, Plato's Pharmacy. And the quote from Derrida: "One can no more separate them, writing and the pharmakon, from each other, think of either one apart from the other, label them, than one can in the pharmacy distinguish the medicine from the poison, the good from the evil, the true from the false, the inside from the outside, the vital from the mortal, the first from the second, etc." So Derrida's saying in that, it may sound rather an extravagant sort of passage, but he's saying that the two meanings, poison and cure, are bound up together. They are conjoined in this, if you like, paradoxical, this aporetic unity, which can never sort of settle down into a single concept. It can never be resolved. That is the crucial thing between Derrida's writing and the old and new criticism. In the new criticism, the great thing about poetry was that through paradox, it was able to bring contradictions into a single unity. It was able to reconcile or resolve the contradictions and treat them as paradoxes, as symbolic, if you like, of a deeper wisdom, wherein all these contradictions will be resolved because the contradictions only result from the limits of human intelligence. The new criticism was in many ways quite a theological movement. You know, if you read, for instance, the essay I mentioned, the Wimsatt-Beardsley essay, The Intentional Fallacy, it's pretty clear that for them, the sacrosanct form of the poem was something that must not be tampered with. It had a kind of sacred resonance to it. Some of their prescriptions and proscriptions, these fallacies they talked about, you know, the fallacy of intentionalism, etc., the fallacy of paraphrase too, really have the ring of theological prohibitions about them. So the point is that Derrida is talking syntax rather than pure semantics. What the new critics were talking about was multiple meanings of individual words, okay? And they might accumulate into the multiple meaning of a poem, but nevertheless, it was something self-contained. It settled down into a structure of paradox. Derrida was talking about logical syntax. When he reads Plato, he takes each instance of that word pharmakon and shows how they are all tied very tightly into a chain of logical implications, which in the end creates a contradiction, an irresolvable contradiction. But he is reading the entire dialogue, and he's doing so on the lookout for its logical grammar, you might say. So something very different from what the new critics were doing. So let me read this poem. It's on page 88. It's two poems, actually. And they're both villanelles again. So it's the three-line poetic form, the three-line, well, a tercet it's called, three-line stanza form, with repeated alternating refrains. All signs point back to archae écriture. Archae écriture is for Derrida a kind of aboriginal writing, a kind of primordial writing from which all other writing, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. All signs point back to archae écriture. How think beyond the trace, the hidden script? Look first to poisons if you'd seek a cure. In Plato's pharmacy, the quickest tour shows pick and mix charts written up, then flipped. All signs point back to archae écriture. You soon find out no antidote that's sure to heal the harm, restore the heartbeat skipped. Look first to poisons if you'd seek a cure. We trust the pharmacist to keep it pure, that stuff prescribed, but he remains tight-lipped. All signs point back to archae écriture. Mercurial gods say written signs endure and travel far, while speech is soon outstripped. Look first to poisons if you'd seek a cure. For that's the sticking point in the script's brochure, the way it keeps the balance firmly tipped. All signs point back to archae écriture. For Plato, it's the sophist's easy lure, the trickster's alibi, the fraudster's crypt. Look first to poisons if you'd seek a cure. But read again. One script he'll not abjure is writing in the soul, pneuma equipped. All signs point back to archae écriture. A metaphor, but let not that obscure his need to fly on wings so lately clipped. Look first to poisons if you'd seek a cure. All signs point back to archae écriture. The point about writing in the soul is one of Derrida's strongest points here. He says, he points out that Socrates rejects writing for all the reasons that we've seen, But then Plato says, but that's bad writing. That is literal writing. That's the writing we do on, parchment scrolls, if you like, or nowadays paper, or the screen for that matter. So that's writing. But Plato says there is a writing in the soul. There is a good writing, and that is the writing which, in Christian tradition, is God's writing in the soul. And I expect in other religious traditions, there is the equivalent of this. It's the idea of a non-material, purely spiritual, purely soul-like script, which is the direct inscription of God's will, or of some kind of ultra-human, beyond the human will, writing itself, not going by way of the merely material. Because one of the points that Derrida makes is that writing has often been denounced by people in the religious traditions as being merely material and therefore gross. So it belongs on one side of those oppositions, like the body versus the soul, for instance, or the flesh versus the spirit. So in the Christian phrase, what is it? The spirit. The letter killeth, but the spirit lives. It's the idea that the letter, once you write something down, it becomes material, concrete, inert, and dead. Letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life, of course. Yeah, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. So it is the idea that, material writing has this bad material character. It is tied to the flesh and to everything that is concrete. Whereas voice is closest to the soul, pneuma, the soul, the wind of spirit, if you like. So all these metaphors have a kind of systematic solidarity. That's the point. But Derrida's point then is that although Socrates denounces writing, he then falls back on this metaphor of another writing, a deeper, more profound spiritual or divine writing, in order to convey what it is for human beings to truly understand something. But he still resorts to writing. And that's one of Derrida's points in his early big book of grammatology, which in some ways is his, I think, his most significant piece of writing. That there is in many different traditions, religious and secular, philosophical traditions worldwide, this very deep-seated mistrust of writing as being something inauthentic and secondary. And yet also this constant falling back on writing as an analogy for what real wisdom is like. He finds it even in psychoanalysis. And there's an interesting example of this in Derrida's early writing, again in the book Writing and Difference, with regard to Freud. This is page 18, and we'll take a look at it. We don't have very long. This will be the last poem I look at, so don't worry, Nitin. I'm aware of the time passing. This one will be quick. So Freud was looking around for some way of giving expression, if necessary via metaphors, to his conception of the unconscious and its relation to the conscious mind. And he hit on the idea of the writing pad, the magic writing pad. I don't know whether you've come across these. I mean, I remember from my childhood, they were very popular. I expect they've been overtaken by some electronic equivalent. But it was basically a pad, like a notepad. But it had pages, it had wax. It had a base of wax covered over with a kind of plasticky, I'm not quite sure what the material was, cover. You would write on the top sheet, and your writing would go through the sheet into the wax, leave an impression. You'd lift the top sheet, and that would leave a blank, a tabula rasa, a blank pad, a blank slate, if you like. But then you put it down again, and the writing would reappear. So the writing would be effaced, it would be removed or erased for so long as you lifted the top flap, the top sheet. But when you put it down, it would reappear as a palimpsest, as a kind of descending, multiple, gradually fainter set of superimposed writings and inscriptions. And Freud, looking around for an image to communicate what he was saying about the unconscious, hit on this. So he says in the epigraph, following the way of the metaphors of the path, of the trace, of the exploration, of the march grooving a pathway opened by a fraction through the neuron, the brain cell, the light or wax, wood or resin to inscribe violently in a nature, in a matter, in a matrix, we ask ourselves, what did Freud do? Well, he came up with the magic writing pad. And here's the poem. What metaphor but writing fits the bill? The other, the magic writing pad, whose hidden traces haunt my memory still. I trawled the sciences for terms to fill my need, but the analogies were bad. Loose-fitting, otiose, or clearly had unwanted kinds of physics overspill. Then I recalled the plaything, one clean sweep, and my inscriptions vanished, yet were there, deep layered in the wax, and sure to keep their form intact. Like that unconscious share of thoughts and memories that came in sleep, or tripped our tongues when we were least aware. So that's a reference to Freud's dream book, his book on the interpretation of dreams, his book on what he called parapraxis, slips of the tongue, which the psychoanalyst regards as deeply meaningful and symptomatic of deep conflicts and so forth. So the point Derrida's making really is that writing is constantly springing to the aid of thinkers, whether it be a psychoanalyst like Freud or philosophers, who are looking for some way of expressing how the mind works, how language works. And they will, on the one hand, regard writing, as Rousseau did, as being secondary and parasitical, as being a mere sort of sub-branch or epiphenomenon, if you like, of speech. On the other, they'll fall back on metaphors, analogies, oblique ruses that bring in writing as an explanatory resource. And that's what happens in Plato's dialogue. The idea of writing in the soul, this sort of spiritualized writing. And yet that idea wouldn't make sense without Plato resorting to the metaphor of writing, even if he straight away says, this is not material writing, this is not the literal script that you see people writing down. On the contrary, it's a spiritualized and quite different thing. But that doesn't remove the fact that he has to fall back on the analogy. And Derrida finds that everywhere. If you read of grammatology, he comes up with numerous and literally hundreds of examples of thinkers trying to avoid falling back on writing because they believe, as Rousseau did, as Plato did, that writing is in the end a bad substitute for the kind of inner wisdom that comes through speech, but falling back on metaphors of writing. Okay, so I think it's time now to go on to questions and discussion. I don't know who's chairing.
Yes. Christina?
Yes, sir. Okay. Before moving on to the Q&A session, we would like to thank Valerie for her wonderful rendition of the poem by Brickler. It was actually very delightful to listen to that, and we're very thankful for that.
Okay.
Now, moving on to the Q&A session. Tom and I would be reading out the questions simultaneously. So in case you're unable to hear us due to any sort of technical problems or perhaps lack of clarity in what we're saying, please let us know. We would repeat the questions. Okay. Over to you, Tom.
Tina. Thank you, Christina.
Yes.
The first question is from Dr. Vimal Mohan John.
Tom, you're not clear.
Hello.
That's better.
Yeah, yes.
The first question is from Dr. Vimal Mohan John. Does deconstructive philosophy make it rather difficult to arrive at commonly agreed on principles? What does this do to the possibility of actual communication or to notions such as justice or desirable action? For instance, what does this do to a legal notion that one doesn't have the right to trample on the freedoms of another?
Parts of that I didn't hear, I'm afraid. It's distorting. I couldn't hear all of it because the sound was distorting.
I'll read it for you.
Okay,
Am
yes.
I clear? Yes, okay.
Okay,
this is a question from Dr. Vimal Mohan John. Does deconstructive philosophy make it rather difficult to arrive at a commonly agreed on principles? What does this do to the possibility of actual communication or to notions such as justice or desirable action? For instance, what does this do to a legal notion that one doesn't have the right to trample on the freedom of another?
Yep.
Was that better? Yes. Okay.
Yes, yeah, that's fine. Yes. Yeah, well, it's a big topic and a complicated one. And the answers, insofar as there are answers, really come from Derrida's long-running debate with Habermas, because the German second-generation critical theorist, Frankfurt theorist, Jürgen Habermas, was for a long time, for a number of decades, in debate with Derrida. Well, he disagreed with Derrida, basically, about that whole question. Habermas theorized the nature of communicative exchange as a basis for political discussion. And he said that if we want to redeem the project of enlightenment, if we want to continue what the European Enlightenment thinkers were striving for, then we have to leave behind quite a lot of the machinery of their philosophy. We have to forget about Kant's transcendental deductions, his transcendental idealism, the whole complicated conceptual apparatus of Kantian thought. And we have to extract from it the idea of an ideal speech situation, which becomes a normative idea. So we can imagine, we don't have it, and we may not ever get it in perfect form, but we can imagine a state of social existence where there would be no distortions in the news or in the exercise of power brought about by unequal access to, for instance, to sources of information. There would be no coercion. All decisions would be arrived at through a free and open exchange of opinion among multiple parties, where it would always be the force of the better argument that won out, not force majeure or force exerted through a police state or through political machinery. In other words, it's a limit point idea, a regulative idea. We may never arrive, we almost certainly will never arrive at a perfect form of it. But now Habermas attacked Derrida. He criticized Derrida really in quite strong terms, thought Derrida was a regressive thinker. He was regressing back beyond the Enlightenment, because the problem he saw with Derrida's thought was the problem that the questioner is raising. Does it leave any room for normative judgments? Can we talk about justice? Can we criticize the power of some people or some parties or some political factions to trample on other people's rights? Derrida's answer was always that yes, we can. We have to recognize, firstly, I suppose the John Stuart Mill principle, that there's always a danger built into representative democracies that the majority will trample the rights of the minority. We have therefore to recognize that even in the best so far attainable state of social justice, there will be minority views which are trampled on. And we have to recognize we have to learn to recognize those instances. We have to be very aware of the exclusionary functions, even of the Enlightenment. I mean, historically, the Enlightenment would, I would say, a lot of people would say, Derrida would have said, the Enlightenment was broadly speaking a good thing, because it taught people that it was possible to see beyond narrow factional interests and to recognize the reality of such a thing as the good of humanity or whatever. In other words, it moved toward cosmopolitan ethics and a cosmopolitan view of the political ideal, which took us beyond narrow kinds of nationalism or narrowly political self-interested views. So, Derrida was very aware of the importance of preserving some version of the Enlightenment project, but at the same time, he recognized that the forms it had taken historically from the 18th century down, especially in periods of revolutionary upheaval, like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, that invariably the ideals of Enlightenment had been twisted, perverted, or at least incompletely realized, and that the permanent danger was the tyranny of the majority, the fact that the enlightened majority could always define their enlightenment in terms that glossed over exclusions and the way that certain people, certain minorities had been oppressed. So eventually, after a long period when they never engaged directly, Derrida and Habermas, but the engagements went on, as so often happens with great thinkers, between their disciples. And so the American journals were full of long-running controversies between followers of Derrida and followers of Habermas. They eventually reconciled after 9/11. There was a series of dialogues between them and a book that was called Philosophy in a Time of Terror. When they didn't entirely meet eye to eye, there were still differences, certainly differences of emphasis. But Habermas recognized, perhaps grudgingly, that it was important to recognize what Derrida was saying because he was speaking for the minorities, or the minorities within minorities, that were often overlooked in the interests of achieving consensus, of achieving some kind of enlightened, rational consensus over issues of common concern. And Derrida recognized, perhaps equally grudgingly, the need to have some kind of limit point regulative ideal in mind in order to have something to aim at. Derrida tended to talk more about democracy, or democracy which is to come. He was always insistent that you can never conceptualize any of these things as having been achieved already. So whenever he talks about democracy, he's careful to say this is a regulative ideal of democratic progress and enlightenment, which has not yet been achieved, and which in principle could never be fully achieved, because there is no state of social justice so perfect that someone is not going to feel marginalized or excluded. And that awareness, as I said earlier, that has at least one of its sources in Derrida's early experience of displacement, marginalization, racial persecution, which was sort of overlaid and multiplied in his case by his very sort of marginal social citizenly status in these years during the war in Algeria, in French administered and French governed Algeria. So a very complicated and very burdensome background of oppression. But this, I think, explains the difference between Habermas and Derrida. I mean, two very important thinkers, many differences between them. Habermas, a very systematic thinker, very much in the Kantian tradition, building systems of thought and patiently elaborating them through multiple stages of revision and extension. Derrida, a very brilliant, very nifty, extraordinarily perceptive, keen-minded, agile, at times, you might say perhaps over-ingenious at times in some of his writings, but very different, utterly different temperaments, Derrida and Habermas. But that reflects different social conditions. Habermas, growing up as a philosopher in the post-war years in Germany after the war, when Germany was striving to build a new constitutional system, democratic constitutional system from the rubble left after the war, quite literally. And therefore, Habermas works at, constructing a systematic philosophy. Derrida trying to make sense of a complex, confusing, at times very painful, very overdetermined situation. So does that answer your question? I'm not sure. Long way around, I suppose.
All right, sir. The next question is a bit lengthy. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's fine.
Yes, the next question is a bit lengthy. It's from Selvan Vedamanikam. And the person posing the question is trying to ask whether their reading is allowed from a deconstructive positioning. Now I will read the question. I may read your poem, Difference, as the poem starts with a writing instance, which is temporarily an instant, coinciding with its occurrence with blurring spatiality and temporality. The poem runs on urgency to deconstruct itself, the urgency amplified and hastened along the structural fault lines. In brackets, the term dehiscent might relate to the mature pod with its structural fault lines well defined from its beginning and a wound waiting to burst along the weak tissues through its development. Brackets closed. The term instant in the first line claims an occurrence. In brackets, its originary nature is a different question, brackets close, but in fact fails to occur as it is made to join a halting flow, where occurrence is not a real occurrence and halting flow is not a real halting, which cannot be deciphered by any perspective, as it is always already an apparent deception enabled by the already cloven nature of language. Is my reading allowed from a deconstructive position? Was that clear?
Yes, yeah. Gosh, yeah, very good. Yeah. Well, I think so. Yes. I mean, the usual position that poets are actually after that. I mean, yeah, that sounds very much, what I was trying to say, I think. Yeah. I hadn't expressed it as clearly as that, but yeah, certainly that's why the word dehiscence is so important for Derrida. He's very good at finding exactly the word. Sometimes he has to make them up, but in that case, I think yes, Selvin got it right. I think yes, it's always impossible to know just how much is in the poem in some fairly definite sense, and how much is there in the interpretation, or how much is drawn out and amplified or extended. But I think that gets it pretty much. It's good. Thanks.
So the next question is from Martin Sampson. He asks, how does postmodernism derive from Deconstruction, and to what extent does the central tenet of the former, the idea that one truth is as valid as another, challenge Derrida's sense of play in structure, sign, and play?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's it's quite a sort of obsession of mine, really, or at least was 20 years ago. To distinguish the two things, because they were often lumped together, not just by sort of mainstream popular cultural commentators, but the three things: post-structuralism, postmodernism, and deconstruction, were often lumped together, especially by right-wing or conservative cultural commentators. But I think there are important differences there. I mean, postmodernism is notoriously the kind of word that's attracted so many differing interpretations, and it gets applied in so many contexts that it's almost impossible to isolate a core of meaning. So there's deconstructive architecture, which seems to be largely a matter of anti-functionalist architecture. Architecture that quotes earlier styles, the classical style or Palladian or whatever, and that mixes them together in a kind of cheerfully, sort of the equivalent of a pun, I suppose, sort of a punning fashion, bringing together different intersecting and contrasting contexts. Postmodern fiction, which is playful and game playing, and plays all kinds of narrative tricks with the reader, and there's postmodern music, which generally tends to be non-developmental and to break with traditional Western ideas of dynamic form and development, and all these things. But I suppose you could narrow it down a bit by saying, well, there's postmodernism in philosophy, and that takes something like a canonical form, I suppose, in Lyotard. The idea of an end to modernity, an end of grand narratives, the proliferation of first-order pragmatic natural narratives, the idea that, really it moves a long way toward post-truth, what nowadays is called post-truth, which I think is a nonsense term. Let us hope that with the departure of Donald Trump, we will hear less about post-truth. I don't know what's happening about that now, actually. Put the news on at 5 o'clock our time and find out whether Biden has won the election. I hope so. Anyway, I mean, postmodernism is generally equated with a deep skepticism with regard to the Enlightenment values like truth and progress, a deep skepticism with regard to meta-narratives, that is, big story accounts of things, like the Enlightenment meta-narrative, which is about progress and freedom and democracy, and that kind of thing. Or the Marxist meta-narrative, which is about revolution and one social system replacing another. Or the Hegelian meta-narrative, which is about Geist discovering itself in the course. But postmodernism is equated with a deep skepticism or a downright rejection of those ideas. Derrida is not saying, and never did say, and should not be interpreted as saying anything like that. Derrida may exercise a kind of vigilant skepticism about the Enlightenment. He has a lot to say about the Kantian project of enlightenment in its very specific Kantian form, and I'll be talking about that tomorrow, so I'll leave that discussion. But deconstruction is far more text-based. Postmodernism tends to issue in large programmatic statements, ironically enough, because postmodernism is premised on the idea of an end to grand statements about this, that, or the other. It's premised on the idea of an end to history, because history has traditionally been seen in terms of developmental narratives, which generally have a fairly elongated chronological structure. But of course, postmodernism itself tends to issue in grand pronouncements like the end of history. So there's a kind of built-in irony there. But I would say, in brief, in answer to Martin's question, deconstruct space. It is, as I've tried to say, it's very much dedicated to the idea of taking a text, be it Rousseau or Plato or Husserl or Saussure, and reading it carefully, slowly, and isolating the points of strain, points of dehiscence, if you like, in the text. Whereas postmodernism typically takes the form of a rather rapid, breezy survey of the field, and then a large pronouncement of the end of this or that. Post-structuralism, well, Martin didn't actually mention post-structuralism. Perhaps I'll leave that till tomorrow. But roughly speaking, post-structuralism is the movement of thought that took flight very rapidly after that conference, after the late 60s, I suppose, in a series of texts by luminaries, by celebrities like Roland Barthes. Barthes had a lot to do with the passage from structuralism to post-structuralism, because early Roland Barthes is a classic high structuralist who writes very keenly perceptive analyses of, for instance, narrative forms or myths, or if you've read Barthes' mythologies, you'll know what early Barthes is like. He will analyze the structure of a modern mythology, like the myth that constructs itself around the brain of Einstein, or the Eiffel Tower, or the latest Citroën car, or certain kinds of food, like steak and chips. And then he'll analyze the structures, the themes, the topoi, the topics that are taken up into a mythical structure, where on the one, basically, according to classic structuralism, you have signifieds and signifieds, as I said. You have the sign, which might be a photograph of a plate of steak and chips. And then you have the signified, which the first order signified, which is just steak and chips, a plate of steak and chips. But then that becomes the signifier of a secondary signified. It signifies certain habits of eating, certain styles of culture, certain social relations, a given state of French society, the status of that food, etc. Like the Eiffel Tower. So signifier, Eiffel Tower, the word spoken or printed, or a picture of the Eiffel Tower, then the thing itself, and then everything it stands for, 19th century French engineering prowess, everything that's most advanced technologically, etc. So these secondary myths build up around the signified of the Eiffel Tower. And he does a beautifully precise, punctual, revealing, ingenious, but very convincing reading of a whole bunch of cultural myths, modern, bourgeois, French, middle of the 20th century myths. That's classic high structuralism. Then he rejects all that and he goes over into post-structuralism. He writes a brilliant book, a wonderfully brilliant book actually, called SZ, about a short novel by Sarrazin, and says, forget structuralism, we're going to do something much more adventurous. We're going to take the basic concepts of structuralism and then we're going to mobilize them and we're going to turn them into something shifting and changeable and wonderfully adaptable. And he writes brilliantly. He's got the style and the gift of inventiveness in his writing to carry this off. And that gets mixed up with postmodernism. Post-structuralism and postmodernism are often seen as very closely related, and I think they are in many ways. But deconstruction is distinct from all that, I think. It shares some sources. It shares a source in Saussure, for instance, and the whole idea of language as the pilot science, the one that provides the concepts and the categories for other disciplines. But then it moves very much away from postmodernism, I think, and it moves just sufficiently away from post-structuralism to make them two distinct movements of thought. And the simple answer is deconstruction is more philosophical. It is more concerned to analyze and to engage with philosophical concepts and categories. It may deconstruct them. It may show those concepts to be much more complicated and more exception prone than was traditionally believed. But yeah, so I think there are real differences between those things, between postmodernism and deconstruction.
Hello. The next question is from Professor Josie Joseph. He writes, I was reminded of the famous dictum of Archilochus. A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog one important thing. Isaiah Berlin once made a distinction between writers who know just one thing well. He writes in brackets, example, Plato, Dante, Dostoevsky, bracket close, and those who draw on a wide variety of experiences, in brackets, example, Aristotle, Shakespeare, Joyce, bracket closes. Derrida perhaps was the combination of both. He thought like a fox and wrote like a hedgehog. Your response, please.
Yeah. Yeah, he certainly thinks, he thinks like a fox. I've got a poem there somewhere actually about the fox and the hedgehog, so I'll read that tomorrow. Yeah, it's true, he's foxy in certain ways. I think not in bad ways. I mean, he strikes many analytic philosophers and many other continental philosophers as being too foxy by half. And I think that's partly because philosophy, in the way it's traditionally been done, on both sides of that divide, I mean, the analytic Anglo-American, Anglophone tradition, I suppose, and the European tradition, mainland Europe, has been relatively patient. It's, yes, it's laboured its conceptions at length. It's tended not to move in quick jumps or associations. On the whole, it's avoided what you might call the free associative, but then that gives the wrong impression of Derrida's work. The experience of reading, I mean, it's not a bad thing to think what it's like to read a Derrida text. And the experience of reading a new Derrida text, and of course they're still appearing because his seminars are being published and translated, and there's still an ongoing Derrida publication industry. The experience of reading a new Derrida text, as I've read them regularly over the past 40 years, more than 40 years, I hesitate to think how many years, is at first you think, goodness me, that was extraordinary. I couldn't have predicted that. I could never have foretold what he was going to have to say about, for instance, friendship, or the politics of friendship, or about 9/11, or about the animal. When Derrida came out with his book, That Animal Which Therefore I Am. And the first impression was quite extraordinary novelty and unexpectedness and originality. And then you think, yes, I can now think as it begins to fit with all that I previously read of Derrida's. Yes, I can see the continuities and the linkages, and to that extent, I might have known roughly what he was going to say. But what you couldn't have predicted would be the style, the extraordinary inventiveness of style. Inventiveness, in a sense, I'll talk about tomorrow. Invention is one of those very words that Derrida picks up on and deploys in various contexts. And invention was originally in the rhetorical tradition, the tradition of writings about rhetoric by ancient and medieval and Renaissance philosophers. The rhetoric was a stock of figures of speech, figures of thought, tropes, ways of using language to particular ends and purposes. And they talked about invention, and they would partly mean what we mean by it, that is, doing something new, originating something, if you like. And partly they were talking about the knack of knowing where to go to get a handy figure of thought, which text to look for to get an example of what you wanted to do. So if you were a good rhetorician, you'd know a lot about rhetoric, and you'd have a whole bunch of rhetorical terms at your fingertips, and you'd pick and choose among the available figures of thought or speech to make your point. And that's I think that's the best way to think about Derrida. He is a fox because he's inventive, but he's also inventive in that sense that he's read a hell of a lot. and that he assembles elements of what he's read. He's a bricklayer in that sense, I suppose, into new and extraordinary patterns. I mean, extraordinary in the sense, extraordinarily revealing and insightful. So I think he's a fox and a hedgehog. I mean, there's no doubt about the hedgehog aspect of his thought. And that's because, you can look back to what he was doing in the late 1960s, even the late 1950s, in those texts from Writing and Difference that I mentioned. And you can see he's doing something that's recognizably akin to that. You can see how he got from A to Z in that sense. That there are moves, there are argumentative moves, there are occasionally metaphorical moves that are repeated, that create a kind of family resemblance or long-term kinship over the span of his writing. On the other hand, each new piece of writing is extraordinarily, I think inventive is exactly the word. So long as you bear in mind that idea, he's not simply spinning ideas out of nothing or plucking them out of the blue. That they do follow on from what he's written before in a recognizable way. So he's something of a fox and a hedgehog.
Thank you, sir. The next question will be the final question of this session because of the time constraint. The question is asked by PJ Thomas, and the question is, can you please comment on the metaphor or analogy of gestation and coming of the formless at the end of the essay Structure and Sign?
The metaphor of what? Of gestation?
Of gestation, yes. Gestation, coming of the formless.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think to be truthful about it, it was a striking sort of metaphor for him to use, and it drew attention. And he may well have been slightly worried about being at the end of the conference and therefore getting overlooked and not making much of a mark. And it's a very dramatic gesture. Presumably he was thinking of Yeats and what rough beast is this slouching toward Bethlehem? Apocalyptic imagery, in the wake and in the shadow of coming wars. And Yeats is very aware of this looming monstrous threat, writing before the Second World War. So all kinds of things were going through his mind there. But I think what he's also doing is trying to dramatize, and you might feel over-dramatize or melodramatize, this sense that something very large is at issue in the whole question of structure and its limits. Later on in his work, 25 years later, he will have a lot to say about the apocalyptic tone in philosophy. And he makes it clear that philosophy has always defined itself against any form of apocalypse, any form of, and by apocalypse he means revelation, the idea that the individual conscience, the individual religious conscience, for instance, may be the ultimate court of appeal. That it's the idea that an individual can experience a revelation that takes him or her beyond any church, any institution, any set of scriptures, any interpretation of the scriptures. And it's the Kierkegaardian idea that true authenticity consists in releasing yourself or absolving yourself from any responsibility to any community, including the Christian community, and simply allowing conscience to be a matter between you and God, direct first-person experience. And Kant, for instance, the quintessential Enlightenment philosopher, defines himself and his project explicitly against that. He polemicizes against people like Hamann, whom he regards as being deluded and visionary and as being very dangerous, threatening the civil peace, threatening the Enlightenment, threatening any kind of intelligent, cooperative human enterprise, precisely because they appeal to the individual conscience. And if you trust only your conscience, then your conscience might tell you to do all kinds of terrible things. And that's what Kierkegaard envisages in his text, Fear and Trembling, the Abraham and Isaac interpretation. So it's, that passage, I've always felt that's a rather, tacked on, to go back to that metaphor from the plagiarist. It's a rhetorical gesture, quite a powerful one. It's partly a matter of drawing attention, and partly because he felt at that stage, admittedly in a rather as yet undeveloped way, that the issue of structure was not just a technical issue. It was not just a particular local tiff, if you like, or quarrel between structuralism and post-structuralism, or structuralism and phenomenology. It opened up this whole very difficult and in some ways quite threatening debate or issue about what are we getting into if we dismiss or if we play down the notion of structure. What if we do relax constraints, structural constraints on our thinking to the extent of admitting these monstrous forms of it's so it's a powerful gesture, and in context I think that the explanation is largely psychological. He wanted a big bang, if you like, at the end of his what turned out to be the inaugural lecture of his career in many ways, because it would have taken very different shape, his career, had he not given that lecture at that time. But it also sort of points forward to those later discussions in his work, which I'll be talking about in the next session tomorrow morning.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful session. We also thank our Professor Rebecca Humphrey from Wales University for collaborating with us in Autumn School.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Thank you very much for a wonderful 2 talks. I look forward to your talks tomorrow.
Oh, thanks.
Professor, I'll email those links. I mean tomorrow's lectures link.
Yes. So it's 9 o'clock again, isn't it?
Yeah, same time.
Same times. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and okay. See you tomorrow morning.
See you tomorrow morning.
Yeah. Okay. See you tomorrow. See you, Chris. Bye. Bye.
Yeah,
Thank you, Professor
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
We had many wonderful questions in the chat box today. Unfortunately, due to your time constraint, we are unable to read out all the questions. I assure you that all the questions will be directed to the speaker. Now we have come to the end.
1 minute, Krishna, 1 minute.
Yes,
Professor Norris, I copied all the questions from the chat box and I will send those questions to your email.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. See you tomorrow then.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, sir. We have reached the end of today's lecture. Thank you all for joining in today. It was a pleasure to have you with us. The feedback forms will be posted in the chat box. Please fill in your details accurately, as your e-certificates will be issued with the information provided in these feedback forms. I thank you all for your presence and active participation throughout the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Some really 2 wonderful talks there. Such amazing talks. I don't know how he manages to speak so long and so eloquently.
Exactly.
You know, he could just speak forever on nearly everything.
Did you get that book, Rebecca? Hedgehog?
Sorry?
Did you get that book, Hedgehog?
No, the one with the title, the Hedgehog one, on Verse and Reflections after Derrida.
Oh.
Do you mean that one?
Actually, Professor shared a copy with me, and I think I can share that with you.
Yeah, do share it with me. No, I didn't have the book that he was going through, but it's lovely to listen to him. I was teaching. He had the philosophy cafe yesterday, and then I was teaching after that into the evening. So I don't think my students wanted any more philosophical thought. I think they were a bit tired after yesterday. But did quite a few of your students join? I know Martin joined, and I think there were a couple of others of mine that joined.